Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. As Shashi Tharoor and his team of MPs end their visit to the United States, we examine what impact it had on American opinion. How high on the US news agenda are the twin subjects of Pahalgam terror and the India-Pakistan conflict? What influence did this delegation have on American news channels and newspapers? Did they change the thinking of the American vice president and the critical senators and congressmen they met? Did they influence American think tanks and scholars? And since their visit coincided with that of a Pakistani delegation led by Bilawal Bhutto, can we compare between the two in terms of their impact on the American media and American public opinion? Those are the issues I shall raise with someone who met the Indian delegation yesterday. He's a senior fellow at the Stimson Centre and one of the foremost scholars of South Asia, Danile Markey. Danile Markey, I'll come to Shashi Tharoor and the delegation of MPs just about leaving Washington in a moment's time. First, let me ask you, how high on the American news agenda are the twin subjects of Pahalgam terror and the India-Pakistan conflict?
Look, I think they were high. Certainly, the terror attacks got attention in all of the major media outlets here in the United States. The initial attacks themselves, the conflict, sort of the over 4-day conflict, I think achieved something like I would describe as a breakthrough in terms of the American media and American public attention. In that kind of your even more mainstream type of news programs and so on were beginning to cover it in a way that the initial terror attacks did not. So you went from high to, I think, very high. But you have to remember, this is a pretty crowded media environment. There are a lot of other stories. And so most of our channels were focusing on other things, even when I say it's very high. Most of the time was spent on many other issues, as you can imagine.
Now, looking back on the way the story has so far been covered by the major newspapers and the major news channels, has the narrative been about potential nuclear war and Kashmir, which is what Pakistan wants, or has it been about terror and the killing of innocent people in Pahalgam, which is what India would have preferred?
I think it shifted over in the way maybe you would say Pakistan would want, but I think was natural here in the United States. It shifted from the terror story to the Kashmir issue and the broader question of India-Pakistan conflict. But I have to explain that by saying that most of your American audiences would be unfamiliar with the reasons for a terror attack in the first place, or the context within which it might take place, or anything about it. And so, and particularly as military operations were taking place between India and Pakistan, they would want to understand where all this came from. And so most media channels were attempting to try to satisfy or fill that gap in what they perceive to be the American public audience understanding of the situation. And so in that way, the India-Pakistan issues came together, and the pure terrorism story probably receded into the background.
One more general question. In the last few weeks, have India and Pakistan been hyphenated in the American media and in American public opinion? Are they seen as equivalents or joint entities?
I wouldn't go so far as to say equivalent by any stretch, but a certain type of rehyphenation did take place over the past month. It has been a long time since I heard India, Pakistan quite as often. And if that's your measure of rehyphenation, then I suppose it happened. But that's only natural given that India and Pakistan were toe-to-toe in a military exchange. So at the same time as that was happening, I still don't think that most people in the United States who heard the stories thought that India and Pakistan were equivalent in any sense.
Okay. Let's then, against that background, Dan, come to Shashi Tharoor and his delegation of cross-party MPs. I believe you met them yesterday. So let me start by asking, what impact did they make on you? What impression did their advocacy leave behind?
First, I would just say I don't think that think tankers like me, people who follow South Asia pretty closely, were maybe the primary audience for this delegation. I mean, they made time for us. We were at the embassy, but it is unusual, I would say, for such an event to have an array of cameras from Indian media organizations. Normally, when think tankers come to the embassy, it might be a quiet, closed door type of session where we get a behind the scenes opportunity to have conversations, maybe more candid conversations with individuals. This was all televised, and there wasn't much of an opportunity for that. So given that, I think others had to accept the notion that principally this was an opportunity for an exchange that would be beamed back to India, and that India was the primary audience for it. I didn't see a lot of American journalists at this event. I think there were other opportunities for them to ask questions. So my principal takeaway was I was not the real audience here, and that the questions were being raised were ones to satisfy a different audience.
But the important thing you said is you didn't see very many American journalists. What does that mean about the coverage this delegation has got? Did they get covered by the newspapers? Did they get covered by television channels?
They got a little bit. They had other opportunities to speak directly to American media, but even there, I think the primary attendees were still focused on speaking to Indian audiences. To the extent that there was some interest here in the United States, it might have been to some of the magazines and other outlets, online outlets that are primarily for Americans who have family in India or came from India themselves. I do not think that it broke through, as far as I can tell, to the major media outlets here in the United States. Some of them, might have sent representatives, but I've seen very little coverage.
That doesn't suggest great success to me, as you say it.
Well, it depends on what the measure of success was for this trip. If the idea was to fundamentally change the way that a vast majority of Americans perceive what happened between India and Pakistan, then no, I don't think there was success. If the goal was to hit a much narrower target and to speak back to India itself, then perhaps there was more success.
More success in speaking back to India, in which case they could have done it sitting in Delhi.
Possibly so. I mean, I think there's a question about whether such a delegation was really necessary for the United States. I mean, in my view, the foreign secretary was here something like a week ago, already had high-level meetings here in Washington with people who are paying attention to the India-US relationship, already had an opportunity to address a lot of the concerns maybe among the policymaking community, the expert community about where India was and what the implications of this conflict with Pakistan might have been. This delegation, in that sense, was maybe icing on the cake or in some ways unnecessary for those audiences.
Let's focus a little, Dan Markey, on the issues and questions that might have arisen and questions that were put to them in particular. Was Shashi Tharoor and the delegation asked for proof that Pakistan was responsible for the Pahalgam terror attack? And if they were, did their answer convince you?
They were asked in multiple forums this versions of this question. I think their answers were fine. I do not think that, frankly, that Washington is looking for airtight evidence of the sort that, say, Pakistan would suggest that India might have needed in order to prosecute military attacks. I think that at some level, the litany of that was rolled out by this delegation of Pakistan's bad behavior is reasonably well known here, so it wasn't a big surprise. So I guess I came away from it wondering exactly who they were trying to convince of this. I'm not sure that there are that many people who need to be convinced of the general point. And on the specific question of whether Pakistani operatives took on this particular operation, we still don't have that kind of clear smoking gun evidence. But I'm not sure that anybody was asking for it back here in Washington, frankly.
So if I understand you correctly, there may not be clear smoking gun evidence, but most people were willing to accept and believe that there was a Pakistani hand behind Pahalgam. They didn't have to prove it.
I don't think that people are asking for that, no.
Okay. Was Shashi Tharoor and the delegation of MPs questioned about the loss of Indian Air Force planes? It's something that's featured in a fairly prominent way in American TV channels like CNN, in the papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. Was that put to them as a question? And if it was, what did they say?
Yeah, I think this has been raised a number of times as well. And I think here the answers tend to be a bit of deflection. That this is not the principal issue, that the operations were broadly successful, and to, I think, put the most positive light on India's ability to punish Pakistan. I'm not sure that part was so convincing, because I think you're right. The broader storyline here, certainly in some of the media, but also in some of the expert commentary, has been some pretty probing questions on the nature of India's military capacity to deal with a problem like Pakistan. But in the back of people's minds, I think what they're also thinking, certainly here in Washington, is what does this say about India's capacity, not just to deal with Pakistan, but a Chinese-backed Pakistan and China itself. And there are some even deeper concerns about India's capabilities. And going forward, I think there's a hope that, frankly, that India will find ways to improve its capabilities, particularly with respect to China.
But you're saying that when this issue came up, the general tendency of the delegation was to deflect.
Yeah, and to move past it, and to certainly there was no desire to say anything or break any news that would be contrary to anything that had been said back in India.
What about the issue that has become an enormous storm of controversy in India, the claim made by Donald Trump, suggested by Marco Rubio in his tweets, that America played a fairly effective role mediating? I notice that President Trump has communicated this message to President Putin because a Russian spokesman has said that Putin was told that America played a role mediating. Did that feature as a question to Shashi or to the delegation, and how did they respond?
Yeah, just like I think this delegation had no interest in getting crosswise with anybody back in New Delhi or making news that wouldn't have come from your own defense ministry or defense officials. They really did not want to say anything that could in any way be perceived as getting crosswise with our president. They were very diplomatic about trying to characterize U.S. diplomacy during the crisis. They did reject relatively categorically the notion that there was some kind of a trade connection between, that as our president has said, that he threatened to cut off trade or he dangled trade incentives, and that's what got the two sides to come back together or to reach a ceasefire. I think they've rejected that, but aside from that, I think they want to steer clear of saying, President Trump is wrong. President Trump wasn't the reason. So they've tried to avoid that particular controversy as well.
So they handled it diplomatically.
I think as much as is possible. I think managing our president and his claims is a challenge for everyone.
Now, I know that Shashi Tharoor and the delegation met with the vice president. I know that they met with members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and its House equivalent. Do you have any sense of how those meetings went and whether they left a favorable impression either with the vice president or with the senators and congressmen they met?
My sense is that they all went very well. But the question is, was there any surprise in that? This is a delegation that would have been quite welcome in the past. India generally is being welcomed with open arms here in Washington, D.C. Maybe the goal was to probe to make sure that opinions hadn't shifted here in the United States in any fundamental way about India, and to the extent that they have been welcomed with open arms, they can see that there's still an interest in the United States in working more closely with India. So the question here in my mind is, did anyone really need convincing? And what was ultimately, again, what was the need? I think that Washington is more than happy to move on past this conflict. That is official Washington. That the overriding goal here in the United States is to work with India on issues that have nothing to do with Pakistan. And so, if that was tested and reinforced by this visit, okay, that's fine. But I'm not sure that it was necessary to even try.
You're making a very important point. You're clearly suggesting that there may not have been a need for this visit, that Washington is happy to move on. Washington is reasonably convinced of the case this delegation wants to make. There was no need to send a delegation specifically to do it.
I didn't see the need for it, but that's up to India. I think, look, at some level, many of the people who work on India in this town, work with India, want to be convinced that India is a stable partner that's capable of managing its regional relationships and that is looking to do big things with the United States. That's what they want to be convinced of. And so this conflict with Pakistan was here seen as a disappointing distraction, a worrisome problem, and potentially worse than that. And if everyone can put it back in a box and safely ignore it for some longer period of time, I think everybody's happy to do that. The question in my mind is whether we should all be seeing it quite that way. But certainly in the conversations between this delegation and US officials, everyone is happy to move past the India-Pakistan conflict.
Tell me, how significant is the meeting with Vice President Vance? He is, after all, the second most important person in your country.
I think it's quite significant. I think that he has signaled in everything that he's ever done so far in office that he's eager to make India a priority. That certainly by visiting India very early in the term, that was a strong sign of his interest. I think that he is an important player within the administration. Day by day, it's hard to tell who's up and who's down, and where exactly his policy place will be as we move forward. But it certainly doesn't hurt to have the vice president on your side and eager to open his doors to an Indian delegation like that.
Now, coincidentally, Bilawal Bhutto and a Pakistani delegation comprising two other former Pakistani foreign ministers is also in America at the same time as Shashi Tharoor and his MPs. Do you have any sense of what sort of impact they've made? This is a very competitive country when it comes to India versus Pakistan.
Look, that group is also making the rounds. They're inviting similar people to similar events. Like I said, neither group is breaking through to a broader American media in a way that the American public will pay attention. But here in Washington, D.C., inside the Beltway, think tanks and others are paying attention and seeing both delegations, and they're each getting or seeking meetings on the Hill and with administration officials. I don't happen to know whether the Pakistani delegation, say, is seeing, I don't think they're seeing the vice president. So if you're keeping score, I suppose India wins on the points there. But otherwise, I think they're trying to make similar rounds. And, I think it should be understood, Washington is full of delegations all the time. So, that these don't make too much news maybe shouldn't be too surprising either.
I don't mean to be at all invidious, but can one compare between the impact of the Pakistani and the Indian delegations? That's a question the audience in India will be asking themselves. In your opinion, which do you think was more influential, swaying American opinion or the American media?
Honestly, I don't think either of them would have moved the needle much with American public opinion generally, or with the media generally. It's hard to pick a real winner on that. I think both sides certainly are primarily playing to audiences that were already paying very close attention to them, that is within their own home countries. And to the extent that they can come home and explain to their own people that they were able to meet with American officials, that everybody was willing to listen to them, they'll be successful. I do not know so far whether the Pakistanis are getting as warm or open a reception from US policymakers. My guess is that they aren't, simply because Pakistan hasn't been getting the same kind of reception that India has been getting before this conflict. There is much less patience for Pakistan in the United States. There's less of a sense that Pakistan has much to offer the United States at this moment in history. And so I would imagine that the tone and tenor and certainly the substance by far is much less in those meetings.
Let me raise one more point with you. It's an issue that has blown up in the last 24 hours, and I noticed that it's a fairly substantial news story in the papers this morning. Is Pakistan's appointment to 3 key counter-terrorism committees at the UN Security Council a snub to India? Or is that overinterpreting the outcome? Or is it a matter of insignificance as far as American media and American think tank experts like yourself are concerned?
Basically, insignificance. I do not think that, first of all, I think that the United States in particular has a jaded view of the United Nations and of many of these types of parts of the United Nations, and has seen repeatedly that various countries are named to lead such groupings, countries that have no business really leading them from a US perspective. And so this time around, India would be unhappy with Pakistan's position in them. It's a sort of a clever move by Pakistan. It's certainly opportunistic, but I don't think, so it's certainly not getting a lot of attention here, and I don't think it's seen as a really significant outcome.
Tell me, we're coming right to the end of this interview. Did any one MP from the Indian side stand out? The expectation in Delhi is that if one MP did stand out, it would be Shashi Tharoor. Was that borne out?
Yes, it was. I mean, he's by far the obvious leader of the delegation. He sits in the middle of the table. He answers most of the questions first and last. He defers to others, certainly on the delegation, who may have something to add. But he definitely fielded the lion's share of all the questions and is the unquestioned leader of the delegation.
And on the Pakistani side, would the star be Bilawal Bhutto?
Yeah, like I say, I haven't had a chance to see them in person yet. I think so. From those who have seen the group, the answer would be he is sitting in a similar position and is fielding the questions first. But there are others on that delegation who are also pretty well known here in Washington, former ambassadors, foreign secretaries, Sherry Rahman. These are people, that are known to those kinds of expert audiences. Just like on the Indian delegation, others are reasonably well known and did pick up some of the questions, but are not the leaders.
Danile Markey, thank you very much for the time you've given me, and thank you very much for giving the audience in India a good sense of how the Indian delegation headed by Shashi Tharoor has been received, viewed in America. I'm very grateful to you. Take care. Stay safe.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.